You're a Viking warrior standing on a windswept cliff, holding a piece of wood carved with strange symbols. But these aren't just scratches in timber. They're messages from the gods themselves, capable of steering your fate toward glory or doom. What would you do if you truly believed these marks could change everything? The Vikings didn't see runes as we see our alphabet today. To them, every carved line was alive with divine energy, every symbol a doorway between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. While we write to communicate, they carved to commune with forces beyond human understanding. Think about it. What if the difference between a Viking's victory and defeat wasn't determined by the sharpness of his axe, but by the wisdom hidden in the symbols he carried? What if their legendary courage came not just from fearless hearts, but from absolute faith in these mystical marks? This wasn't superstition to them. This was survival. When a Viking chieftain faced a crucial decision, whether to raid a monastery, when to set sail, or whom to trust, he might turn to the runes for guidance. The symbols would be cast like dice, their positions read like a map of destiny. Lives hung in the balance of these ancient letters. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. The Vikings believed these runes were born from ultimate sacrifice. According to their legends, Odin, the All-Father himself, didn't simply create these symbols. He suffered for them. He bled for them. He nearly died for them. Imagine hanging upside down from the world tree for 9 days and nights, pierced by your own spear, with no food or water, all to grasp the secret of these powerful symbols. That's the price Odin paid, and every Viking knew this story. They understood that true power always comes with a cost. The runes weren't just tools for writing poetry or marking territory. They were instruments of transformation. A Viking might carve protection runes into his shield before battle, believing they would turn enemy blades aside. A woman might inscribe love runes to win a heart, or healing runes to save a dying child. These weren't mere wishes. They were acts of faith that could reshape reality itself. And this is where the story gets truly gripping. Because if you're going to understand the Vikings, you need to understand that they lived in a world where the invisible was more real than the visible, where symbols held more power than swords, and where the right combination of carved lines could mean the difference between life and death. If you love history and want to unravel the mysteries of great empires, like this video, subscribe to the Medieval Archives channel and don't miss any episode. Now let me tell you about the most brutal quest for knowledge in Norse mythology. And trust me, this isn't your typical hero's journey. This is the story of how the king of the gods himself became the ultimate student, paying a price that would make even the bravest Viking warrior think twice. Picture young Ragnar sitting by the fire in his grandfather's longhouse, the old man's weathered hands tracing invisible symbols in the air as he spoke. "Boy," the grandfather whispered, his voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom, "do you know why we carve these marks with such reverence? Do you know what Odin sacrificed to bring them to us?" The boy shook his head, leaning closer as shadows danced across the carved wooden walls. The grandfather's eyes grew distant, as if he could see across the 9 worlds themselves. Long ago, before mortals knew the secret of the runes, Odin looked down from his throne and saw that even he, the All-Father, lacked the deepest wisdom. The runes existed, yes, but they were wild things, untamed forces that dwelt in the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree. They belonged to no one and everyone, scattered like seeds in the cosmic wind. But here's where the story gets fascinating. Odin didn't send armies to claim this knowledge. He didn't use his authority as king of the gods. Instead, he chose the path of ultimate sacrifice. He took his own spear, Gungnir, and pierced himself through the side. Then, wounded and bleeding, he hung himself upside down from the mighty branches of Yggdrasil. Think about this for a moment. The most powerful being in Norse mythology voluntarily became helpless, dangling like a criminal, all for the sake of learning. No food touched his lips. No water soothed his throat. For 9 days and 9 nights he hung there, his life force slowly draining away. But why 9 days and 9 nights? The Vikings believed 9 was the most sacred number, appearing throughout their cosmology. 9 worlds existed in their universe. 9 was the number of completion, of transformation. Odin's ordeal had to match the cosmic significance of what he sought to gain. As the grandfather continued his tale, young Ragnar felt something stirring within him. He watched his grandfather's scarred hands, hands that had carved countless runes, hands that had fought in battles, hands that had comforted the dying. "Grandfather," Ragnar interrupted, "if Odin suffered so much for this knowledge, what does that mean for us?" The old man smiled, recognizing the hunger in his grandson's eyes. "It means, boy, that true power never comes free. Every rune we carve, every spell we cast, every piece of wisdom we gain, it all connects back to that sacrifice. When we use the runes, we're not just writing letters. We're channeling the very essence of divine suffering transformed into sacred knowledge." On the 7th day of his ordeal, Odin began to weaken seriously. His vision blurred, his strength faded, and death crept closer. But it was precisely in this moment of ultimate vulnerability that something extraordinary happened. As he hung there, suspended between life and death, between wisdom and ignorance, the runes began to reveal themselves. They didn't appear as gentle gifts. They came screaming from the depths of the world tree's roots, each symbol burning itself into Odin's consciousness like brands of fire. The knowledge was so intense, so overwhelming that it nearly shattered his divine mind. But he held on, gathering each rune like precious gems, even as they seared his very essence. On the 9th night, as Odin teetered on the edge of death itself, the final rune revealed itself. With this ultimate symbol came complete understanding, not just of the runes themselves, but of the profound connection between sacrifice and wisdom, between suffering and power. Only then did he cut himself down, forever changed by his ordeal. Young Ragnar sat in silence for a long moment, processing this tale. Then he looked up at his grandfather with new determination. "I want to learn the runes too, grandfather. I want to understand what Odin understood." The old man's expression grew serious. "And you will, boy. But remember, every time you carve a rune, you're participating in that same sacrifice. The knowledge comes with responsibility, and the power comes with a price. Are you prepared for that?" This is what made the Vikings so different from other cultures of their time. They didn't see learning as casual or easy. They understood that true wisdom required sacrifice, that real power demanded payment. When a Viking carved runes, he wasn't just writing. He was reenacting the most sacred moment in their mythology, connecting himself to the divine ordeal that made all runic knowledge possible. The tension in the longboat was so thick you could cut it with an axe. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon like dark omens, and the crew of 30 Vikings found themselves caught between two very different kinds of faith. At the bow stood Captain Einar, a weathered nobleman whose fingers traced protective runes carved into his shield. At the stern, Bjorn the Iron Hand gripped his sword tighter, muttering under his breath about foolish magic tricks. This wasn't just any raiding party. This was a crew divided by doubt, and their leader carried the heaviest burden of all. Einar had been here before. 3 winters ago, he'd trusted completely in the runes, following every sign and portent as his ship approached the Irish coast. The runic divination had promised victory, wealth, and safe return. Instead, it had led them straight into a trap. Half his men never made it home, and Einar still woke some nights hearing their screams echoing across the water. Yet here he was again, running his thumb over the freshly carved protection runes on his shield, feeling their familiar grooves like old scars. Why? Because deep down, beneath the doubt and the pain, he couldn't shake the belief that had been hammered into him since childhood. The runes were the gods' gift to mortals. To abandon them completely would be to abandon his very identity as a Viking. "Captain," Bjorn called out, his voice carrying over the creaking of the ship's timbers, "those clouds are getting darker. We should turn back before the storm hits." His hand never left his sword hilt. That was Bjorn's way. If he couldn't cut it, stab it, or bash it with his shield, he didn't trust it. Einar looked up at the approaching storm, then down at his shield. The runes seemed to shimmer in the strange light that comes before a tempest. Was it his imagination, or were they actually glowing? He'd heard stories of runes that blazed with divine fire in moments of great need, but he'd never seen it himself. "The runes say we push forward," Einar announced, though his voice lacked the conviction it once held. "They promise safe passage through the storm." A ripple of unease ran through the crew. Some nodded respectfully. These were the men who still believed, who saw their captain's noble blood as proof of his connection to the gods. Others, mostly common warriors like Bjorn, exchanged worried glances. They'd heard whispers about what happened 3 winters ago, about the cursed expedition that had cost so many lives. Young Olaf, barely 16 and on his first raid, worked up the courage to speak. "Captain, what if the runes are wrong again? What if they're leading us into another trap?" The question hung in the air like the smell of lightning before a storm. Einar's jaw tightened. This was the fear that haunted every Viking leader who relied on runic divination. The terrible possibility that the gods might be silent, or worse, that they might be testing his faith through false signs. "Boy," Einar said quietly, "do you think I haven't asked myself that same question every day for 3 years? Do you think I don't see the faces of the men we lost in my dreams?" The wind picked up, and the ship began to rock more violently. But something strange was happening. The runes on Einar's shield were definitely glowing now, pulsing with a soft blue light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the waves. Several crew members pointed and whispered among themselves. Bjorn squinted at the shield, his practical mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "Captain, what in Thor's name is that?" Einar stared at his shield in wonder and terror. The runes were brighter now, so bright that they cast shadows on the deck. This wasn't supposed to happen. In all his years of studying the ancient symbols, he'd never experienced anything like this. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "But something is happening. The gods are speaking." The storm was almost upon them now. Lightning flickered in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. But the glowing runes seemed to be forming a pattern, arranging themselves in a way that Einar had never seen before. It was as if the symbols were alive, reorganizing themselves to deliver a message. Bjorn shook his head in frustration. "Captain, I don't care if your shield is glowing like the northern lights. Steel is steel, and storms are storms. We need to get to shore before we're all swimming with the fish." But Einar couldn't look away from the runes. They were spelling out something, he was sure of it. A warning? A promise? Or perhaps a test of his faith after the failure 3 years ago. The rain began to fall harder, and the crew prepared for the worst. Some prayed to Thor for protection from the storm. Others checked their weapons and prepared to fight whatever enemies might await them on the far shore. But all eyes kept returning to their captain's glowing shield, wondering whether they were witnessing divine intervention or sailing toward their doom. In that moment, suspended between faith and doubt, between the nobility's trust in ancient magic and the common warrior's faith in steel, Einar made his choice. He raised his shield high, letting the glowing runes cast their strange light across the faces of his crew. "We sail forward," he declared. "Whatever the gods have planned for us, we'll face it as Vikings. The runes have never glowed like this before. If this is our test, then we'll prove ourselves worthy of it." The storm struck with full fury, and the fate of 30 Viking souls hung in the balance between divine protection and mortal courage. The fire crackled in the center of the great hall, casting dancing shadows across the carved wooden pillars. Outside, ravens called to each other through the autumn mist, their harsh voices adding an ominous soundtrack to the evening. King Harald sat rigid on his throne, trying to hide the tremor in his hands as he watched the old woman arrange her runes on the polished oak table before him. Sigrid the Wise had been reading the future for over 40 years. Her fingers, gnarled with age but steady as stone, moved across the carved symbols with the confidence of someone who had seen too much. The courtiers pressed closer, their whispers barely audible above the crackling flames, but Sigrid seemed oblivious to their presence. For her, only the runes mattered. "What do you see, wise woman?" Harald asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. He'd summoned Sigrid because rival kingdoms were gathering armies, and he needed to know which way the winds of fate were blowing. But there was something in her expression tonight that made his blood run cold. Sigrid's weathered hands hovered over the runes for a long moment. The firelight caught the ancient symbols, making them seem to pulse with their own inner light. Then, without warning, she gasped and pulled her hands back as if the runes had burned her. "My lord," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. The runes speak of endings. They show me a great king falling when the leaves turn golden again. The hall fell silent except for the steady drip of melting snow from the roof beams. Harold felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "Which king?" he demanded. "Which kingdom faces this fate?" But Sigrid's clouded eyes fixed on his face, and he already knew the answer. The old woman had served his father and his father's father, and Harold had never seen her look so stricken. She'd predicted victories and defeats, good harvests and harsh winters, but never had she trembled like this. Here's what made Sigrid so dangerous and so powerful. She didn't just read runes for peasants seeking love potions or farmers worried about their crops. She held the ear of kings, and her prophecies could change the course of entire wars. Think about it. If you were a medieval ruler and someone told you that attacking in spring would bring victory while waiting until summer meant defeat, wouldn't that information be worth more than gold? This was the original form of information warfare. Sigrid and women like her were the medieval equivalent of intelligence agencies, wielding knowledge as their weapon. They could topple dynasties with a single prophecy, convince armies to march or retreat, and turn allies into enemies with carefully chosen words. "Speak plainly, woman," Harold commanded, but his voice cracked slightly. "What do the runes show?" Sigrid gathered the scattered symbols with trembling hands. "They show a crown falling into dark water. They show eagles circling above an empty throne. They show—" She paused, closing her eyes as if to shut out the vision. "They show your queen weeping over a bloodied banner." The courtiers began to murmur among themselves, some crossing themselves despite their pagan beliefs. But Harold noticed something else. The way his chief advisor, Ragnar, leaned forward with interest rather than fear. The way his brother-in-law's eyes gleamed in the firelight. Information was power, and Sigrid had just handed them the most valuable information of all, the knowledge that the king's days were numbered. "When?" Harold asked through gritted teeth. "When will this happen?" "Before the first frost," Sigrid replied. "The runes are clear. Death comes with the autumn winds." Now here's where this gets really interesting. Harold faced the same dilemma that rulers throughout history have confronted when given unwelcome prophecies. If he believed Sigrid and changed his plans, would he be preventing the prophecy or fulfilling it? If he dismissed her words as superstition, would he be sealing his own fate? The ravens outside seemed to call louder now, their cries mixing with the wind that rattled the shutters. Harold stood slowly, his mind racing. He could execute Sigrid for treason, but that would only confirm to everyone that he feared her prophecy. He could ignore her completely, but Vikings who defied clear runic warnings often found themselves facing exactly the fate they'd tried to avoid. "Tell me," he said quietly, "is there any way to change what you've seen?" Sigrid's expression softened slightly. "My lord, the runes show what will be, not what must be. But I have seen many kings try to outwit fate, and most of them simply ran straight into the very doom they sought to escape." The fire popped loudly, sending sparks up toward the smoke-blackened rafters. In that moment, Harold realized the terrible truth. It didn't matter whether Sigrid's prophecy was real or not. The moment she spoke those words in front of his court, they became dangerous. His enemies would see opportunity in his supposed weakness. His allies would begin to distance themselves. His own family would start positioning themselves for the succession. This was the ultimate power of the rune readers. They didn't just predict the future, they helped create it. By speaking their prophecies aloud, they set in motion the very events they claimed to foresee. As the evening wore on and the courtiers gradually dispersed, Harold found himself alone with Sigrid and the dying fire. The old woman was packing her runes away, her movements slow and careful. "One more question," he said softly. "Do you truly believe what you saw tonight?" Sigrid paused, her hands still for a moment. When she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with something that might have been compassion. "My lord, I have been reading the runes for 40 years. I have seen them lie, and I have seen them tell truths that no one wanted to hear. Tonight, they spoke more clearly than they ever have before." She stood to leave, then turned back one final time. "But remember this, great king. The runes show us paths, not prisons. What matters is not the prophecy itself, but what you choose to do with the knowledge." With that, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving Harold alone with his thoughts and the weight of a future that might or might not be written in stone. Did you know that many Vikings actually preferred to die rather than disobey a bad runic omen? If you're enjoying this video, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more incredible stories from the past. And tell me in the comments, would you believe a runic prophecy if it predicted your own death? The carved wooden tablet felt wrong in Thorvald's hands. He couldn't explain why, but something about these runes made his skin crawl. The symbols looked perfect, too perfect perhaps, and they told him exactly what he wanted to hear. The raid on the Saxon monastery would bring great wealth, the runes promised. No lives would be lost. The gods smiled upon his venture. It should have been the answer to his prayers. Instead, it filled him with dread. Thorvald had been a chieftain for 15 years, and he'd learned to trust his instincts. These runes had arrived from his supposed ally, Jarl Erik, along with a message of friendship and shared prosperity. But something nagged at him, like a splinter beneath the skin. The messenger who'd brought them had avoided his eyes, and the runes themselves seemed to shimmer with an oily, unnatural light. "What troubles you, my lord?" asked Astrid, his most trusted advisor. She'd been studying the runes for an hour, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The message seems clear enough. The gods favor our expedition." Thorvald set the tablet down on the oak table, his fingers lingering on the carved symbols. "That's exactly what troubles me, Astrid. When have the gods ever made anything easy? When have they ever promised victory without sacrifice?" This was the dark side of runic power that most people never considered. Just as the symbols could channel divine wisdom, they could also be twisted by mortal cunning. A skilled rune carver could create false messages, counterfeit prophecies that looked authentic to untrained eyes. It was the medieval equivalent of forging documents, but with far deadlier consequences. Astrid picked up the tablet again, examining each symbol carefully. "The craftsmanship is excellent," she admitted. "Whoever carved these knew their work. But you're right, there's something off about the message. It's too convenient, too reassuring." The truth was, Thorvald had reasons to be suspicious of Jarl Erik. They'd been rivals for years, competing for the same trade routes and tribute rights. A successful raid by Thorvald would make him wealthy enough to challenge Erik's dominance in the region. Would Erik really help his rival grow stronger? "There's another problem," Astrid continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Look at this symbol here." She pointed to a rune near the center of the tablet. "It's carved slightly differently than the others. The angle is wrong and the depth is inconsistent. It's almost as if someone altered it after the original carving was complete." Thorvald leaned closer, his heart beginning to race. If the runes had been tampered with, then the entire message was suspect. But more than that, it meant someone was actively trying to deceive him, to lead him into a trap using the most sacred symbols of his faith. "Show me," he said grimly. Astrid traced the altered rune with her finger. "This should be the symbol for protection or divine favor. But see how this line has been deepened? And this curve extended? It changes the meaning entirely. Instead of divine protection, it actually means hidden danger or unseen enemy." The implications hit Thorvald like a physical blow. If Astrid was right, then the runes weren't promising success at all. They were warning him of betrayal, of enemies disguised as friends. But the alterations were so subtle that most people would never notice them. "This is Loki's work," Thorvald muttered, invoking the name of the trickster god. Not literally, perhaps, but this kind of deception, this twisting of sacred symbols for personal gain, it's exactly what he would do. In Norse mythology, Loki was famous for his ability to corrupt and manipulate, to turn strength into weakness and wisdom into folly. He didn't usually lie outright. That would be too obvious. Instead, he twisted the truth, presented facts in ways that led people to wrong conclusions. This felt like the same kind of subtle, insidious betrayal. Thorvald stood abruptly, his decision made. "Build up the fire," he commanded. "We're going to burn these cursed things." "My lord," Astrid protested. "Even if they're false, they might still contain clues about Erik's true intentions. Perhaps we should study them further." But Thorvald was already moving toward the hearth, the wooden tablet clutched in his hands. "No, these symbols are an abomination. They pervert the sacred runes, turn them into weapons of deceit. They must be destroyed." He threw the tablet into the flames, watching as the carved symbols blackened and began to curl. The fire seemed to burn brighter for a moment, as if the destruction of the false runes released some kind of trapped energy. But as he watched the flames consume the lying symbols, a terrible thought occurred to him. What if he was too late? What if Eric had already set his trap in motion, counting on the false runes to delay Thorvald's suspicions? What if other chieftains had received similar messages, each one carefully crafted to lead them into disaster? The burning tablet crackled and hissed, and Thorvald could have sworn he heard something like laughter in the flames. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the shutters. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of approaching hoofbeats. "Astrid," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off the fire, "send word to our allies. Tell them to be wary of any runic messages they might receive, and double the guard. I have a feeling we're about to discover just how deep Eric's deception goes." The false runes were reduced to ash now, but the damage they represented might already be done. In a world where sacred symbols carried the weight of divine truth, the ability to forge those symbols was perhaps the most dangerous weapon of all. It turned faith into a liability, made every prophecy suspect, and forced people to doubt the very foundations of their beliefs. As the rain began to fall harder and the hoofbeats grew closer, Thorvald realized that this was Loki's true victory, not just the deception itself, but the way it poisoned trust, making people question everything they had once held sacred. The trickster god would be laughing indeed, knowing that his greatest trick was teaching mortals to lie with the voices of the gods themselves. The old Jarl's breathing came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle against the inevitable. Magnus the Bold, who had once terrorized the coasts of England and sailed beyond the edge of known maps, now lay dying in his bed, surrounded by his family and the flickering light of oil lamps. But his eyes weren't focused on the faces of his loved ones. They were fixed on the knife in his trembling hand and the smooth piece of oak wood beside him. "Father," his daughter Ingrid whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Rest now. You've done enough." But Magnus shook his head weakly. "Not yet, child. Not yet." His voice was barely a whisper, but his determination was absolute. "I have one last thing to do." With enormous effort, he raised the knife and began to carve. Each cut into the wood required all his remaining strength, but he pressed on, forming the ancient symbols with the same precision he'd used for 60 years. These weren't just any runes, they were his final spell, his last attempt to reach across the void between life and death. You see, the Vikings believed that death was just another journey, and like any journey, it required preparation. But Magnus wasn't carving protection runes for the afterlife, or trying to ensure his place in Valhalla. He was doing something far more profound. He was trying to carve his essence into the world itself, to leave a piece of his soul behind in the form of runic wisdom. "Tell me again," he gasped to his eldest son, Eric, "the words of Egil the Wise." Eric, fighting back his own tears, recited the ancient saying, "If our actions are forgotten, the runes are our immortality." That's exactly what Magnus was attempting. He knew that his raids and conquests would fade from memory, that his name would eventually be lost to time. But these runes, if carved with enough intent and power, could carry something essential about him forward into the future. They could preserve not just his words, but his spirit itself. Each symbol he carved held a piece of his life story. The rune for courage remembered his first battle as a young warrior. The symbol for wisdom contained the lessons he'd learned from 50 years of leadership. The mark for kinship held his love for his family, his hopes for their future, his fears about leaving them behind. His hands shook violently now, and the knife slipped several times, but Magnus refused to let anyone help him. This was something he had to do alone, in the same way that each person must face death alone. The runes had to be carved by his own hand, infused with his own life force, or they would be just empty symbols. "What are you writing, father?" young Olaf asked. He was only 12, and this was his first time witnessing someone's death. The boy watched in fascination as his grandfather's weathered fingers traced symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Magnus paused in his carving, looking up at his grandson with eyes that held the weight of approaching eternity. "I'm writing a message to the future, boy. To people who will live long after my bones have turned to dust. I'm telling them what it means to be brave, to be loyal, to live with honor even when the world seems dark. But here's what made this moment so powerful. Magnus wasn't just writing about these virtues, he was demonstrating them. Even in his final moments, racked with pain and barely able to breathe, he was showing his family what it meant to face death with dignity and purpose. The runes were becoming more than symbols. They were becoming a living example of the values he wanted to pass on. The carving took him nearly an hour, with long pauses when exhaustion forced him to rest. But gradually, the wooden tablet filled with symbols that seemed to grow more vivid as he worked. By the time he carved the final rune, his family could swear they saw a soft golden light emanating from the wood itself. "There," Magnus whispered, setting down the knife with trembling hands. "It's finished." Ingrid picked up the tablet, studying the symbols through her tears. "What does it say, Father?" Magnus smiled, and for a moment, his face regained some of its old strength. "It says that love is stronger than death, that courage can be passed from one generation to the next, that as long as someone remembers the old ways, the old wisdom, then nothing truly dies." He closed his eyes, his breathing growing even shallower. "But most of all, it says that I was here, that I lived and loved, and tried to do right by my family and my people. When the last person who knew me personally has died, when my grave marker has crumbled to dust, these runes will still carry that truth forward." The room fell silent, except for the soft crackling of the lamps. Magnus's family gathered closer, each of them touching the carved tablet, feeling the warmth that still seemed to pulse from the freshly cut symbols. "Father," Eric said softly, "will the runes really keep you alive somehow?" Magnus opened his eyes one last time, fixing his son with a gaze that held both infinite sadness and infinite peace. "Not alive, boy, but not forgotten either. Every time someone reads these symbols, every time they remember the stories they tell, a piece of me will be there with them." The runes don't promise immortality, they promise continuity. They promise that the things that matter most will survive the ending of everything else. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the shutters, Magnus the Bold drew his final breath, his hand resting on the carved tablet that held his last gift to the world. The runes he'd carved would outlive him by centuries, carrying forward not just his words, but his spirit, his values, and his unshakable belief that some things are too important to let die. In the end, that's what the runes meant to the Vikings, not just magical symbols or pretty decorations, but a way to build bridges across time itself. They were humanity's way of saying to the future, "We were here, we mattered, remember us." And in the quiet of that dawn, surrounded by his grieving family and the soft glow of his final runic spell, Magnus achieved the only kind of immortality that truly matters. The immortality of memory, love, and wisdom passed from one generation to the next. The last Viking longships disappeared from the horizon over 1,000 years ago, but walk through any city today, and you'll see their spiritual descendants everywhere. That tattoo on the barista's arm telling the story of her struggles. The family crest hanging in someone's living room. The motivational quote written in flowing script on a coffee shop wall. Even the emojis we use to express what words can't quite capture. We still carry our own sacred symbols, don't we? Think about it. When you choose a particular image for your profile picture, aren't you doing something remarkably similar to what a Viking did when he carved runes into his shield? You're taking a symbol and saying, "This represents who I am. This carries my essence into the world." The medium has changed, but the human need to leave marks of meaning remains exactly the same. The Vikings carved their runes into wood, stone, and metal because they believed these symbols could outlast their mortal bodies. We post our thoughts, our photos, our digital footprints because we believe they'll preserve something essential about us for future generations. The tools are different, but the hope is identical, that some part of us will survive beyond our physical existence. But here's what's really fascinating about the Viking approach to symbols. They understood something we sometimes forget in our digital age. The power of a symbol isn't just in its meaning, but in the intention behind it. When Magnus the Bold carved his final runes with trembling hands, he wasn't just creating pretty decorations. He was pouring his life force, his accumulated wisdom, his deepest values into those symbols. How many of us approach our modern symbols with that same level of intention? When we choose the words that define us, the images that represent us, the beliefs that guide us, do we do it with the same reverence that a Viking showed when carving runes? The truth is, we're all rune carvers now. Every time we write something meaningful, every time we choose a symbol that represents our values, every time we try to capture something important about ourselves in a form that others can understand, we are participating in the same ancient human tradition that drove those Norse warriors to scratch symbols into stone. The Vikings believed that their runes connected them to the gods, to the cosmic forces that shaped reality itself. Maybe our modern symbols do something similar. They connect us to the vast network of human consciousness, to the collective story we're all writing together. Your social media post, your personal motto, your favorite song lyrics, they're all part of the same web of meaning that the Vikings were trying to weave with their runes. And just like those ancient symbols, our modern markers of identity can protect us, inspire us, and even deceive us. The Viking who carved protection runes into his sword wasn't so different from the person who keeps a meaningful photo in their wallet or wears a necklace with special significance. We all carry talismans, whether we call them that or not. The Vikings understood that symbols have power because we give them power. The runes weren't magical because of some supernatural force. They were magical because people believed in them completely, lived by them, and were willing to die for them. Our modern symbols work the same way. They're as powerful as we make them, as meaningful as we allow them to be. So as you go about your day, carrying your own collection of personal symbols, your profile pictures, your meaningful jewelry, your favorite quotes, your chosen words, remember that you're part of an unbroken chain that stretches back to those Viking rune carvers. You're participating in humanity's eternal effort to create meaning, to leave marks that say, I was here, I mattered, I had something worth preserving. The Vikings are gone, but their understanding of symbols lives on in every meaningful mark we make on the world. The runes may be carved in different materials now, but the human heart that creates them remains exactly the same. If you enjoyed this journey through the mystical world of Viking runes, give this video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the Medieval Archives for more epic stories from the past. Until next time, keep carving your own runes into the world, and remember, every symbol you choose is a small act of immortality.